It was the early hours of the morning. World War I was well underway, and two soldiers, Henry Johnson and Eden Roberts, sat in the dark on sentry duty. Positioned at the edge of the Argonne Forest in an isolated listening post, their job for the night was to listen and to look for signs of the enemy. They peered into the darkness, their ears straining to hear, and the light of the moon revealing shapes and shadows. It was quiet, which was good. They waited. Still nothing. Time always seemed to move so slowly on sentry duty. Then their ears pricked up. It was a noise. "What's that?" Johnson whispered. "Rats, I guess," Roberts whispered back.
Uh-oh, I don't like the sound of this. I bet it's more than rats.
Oh, you're right. They heard another noise. This time, it was voices. German voices. The two men followed their training and moved apart from each other. Johnson located a case of hand grenades and laid them out, ready to go. The two men then readied their French Lebel rifles, a definite downgrade from their American Springfields. The voices then faded. It was quiet again, but this time the silence was eerie. Maybe it was just a passing German patrol, they thought. Still, they couldn't relax just yet. The men tensed, listening for more sounds of the enemy. But nothing, just the rustle of the wind through the trees. A few more quiet moments passed before they heard a metallic-sounding click. They turned to face the direction of the sound, their hearts pounding. They heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. It was the sound of wire cutters. The Germans were cutting through the barbed wire. The two men sprang into action, and Johnson quickly lobbed a grenade in the direction of the enemy before firing a flare. Roberts began to yell, "Corporal of the Guard! Corporal of the Guard!" The Germans opened fire, and Johnson dropped to the ground, covering his head as a volley of grenades descended upon them. Johnson had been hit, but thankfully not badly. His left leg and his left side began to sting. He sat up and looked towards Roberts. Poor Roberts was in far worse shape. Blood poured down his face and his leg was soaked in crimson. Johnson scrambled to his feet and raised his rifle. In the darkness, he saw a silhouette approaching and he fired at it. Then he saw another figure approaching. This time, from the left, he fired at it too. He was down to the last bullet in the magazine. It only carried 3. He saw the shape of another man coming towards him from the right. He whipped round to face them and he fired his final shot at point-blank range, right into the German's chest. There was a thud as the fatally wounded man fell to the floor. Johnson put a new clip into his rifle and the unthinkable happened. The gun jammed. He could now see around 20 Germans approaching from all sides. He was surrounded. "Corporal of the Guard," he called out. "Corporal of the Guard." Roberts was terribly wounded, but he was still doing his best to help. He'd propped himself up and was hurling grenades at the enemy. A German rushed towards Johnson, raised their Luger pistol and fired it, hitting him in the thigh. Johnson had to act quickly. His rifle was now useless. So he turned it around and with all his might he clobbered the German over the head with the butt of the gun. The force of that blow was so strong that the gun's handle shattered. The German managed to fire off one more shot into Johnson's foot before collapsing to the ground, unconscious. Johnson could hear Germans shouting and the sounds of gunfire and grenades all around him. Why had no one come to help yet? He looked over at Roberts and could see that 2 Germans, one by his feet and one by his head, were trying to drag him away. They were trying to take him as a prisoner. Henry Johnson and Eden Roberts, though Americans, were part of a regiment that had been loaned to the French army. Now, their regiment, the 369th, had an unwritten rule. They would never, ever be captured or lose any of their men to the enemy. Johnson was not going to let that rule be broken today. He ran towards Roberts, not just his fellow soldier, but his friend. His body coursing with adrenaline, he unsheathed his bolo knife and let out a terrifying battle cry before driving the 9-inch blade deep into the German's skull. He looked around. Where was that second German? Now, before Johnson could even catch his breath, the German that he'd knocked out earlier had recovered and was charging towards him, firing his pistol. Johnson lunged at him with his bolo knife. The Germans stood no chance against Johnson's fury and soon fell to the floor, a bloody, crumpled mess. Johnson could see more of the enemy, gathered by the gap that they'd cut in the barbed wire. He lobbed a few more grenades in their direction for good measure, and with that, the Germans fled, their tails between their legs. Johnson had given it his absolute all, exhausted and suffering from 21 wounds. He fell to his knees. With his knife in hand, he rested against the trench wall. "Corporal of the guard," he called out one more time before drifting into unconsciousness. Johnson and Roberts were very badly injured, but they would survive. From the 40 enemy grenades, 7 wire cutters and 3 automatic pistols that the enemy had left behind, it's thought that the two men single-handedly repelled at the very least 24 Germans.
Wow, what bravery, what heroics. I bet they were seriously decorated after that.
Well, the French certainly appreciated their efforts, and they were awarded the Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military honours. They were the first 2 Americans to ever receive this award, and what's more, Johnson's medal also included the Gold Palm for extraordinary valour or courage.
I'm sensing a but coming along.
Yep, you're right. Their own nation, the United States, awarded them nothing. They were denied any award because of the colour of their skin. You see, Johnson and Roberts were part of the 15th New York National Guard, an all-black regiment. A regiment whose performance in World War I was so stellar that they became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. They would spend 191 days in the front lines, the longest of any American regiment in the war. They never lost a foot of ground, and they never had a man taken prisoner. Now, if that's not impressive enough, they were a regiment that was fighting 2 wars. A war for democracy abroad, and a war for democracy at home. This is the true story of the Harlem Hellfighters. Our story takes us to the summer of 1914. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, World War I had broken out in Europe. The Allies versus the Central Powers, each side armed with new technologies that would change the face of war and make this the most brutal and devastating conflict that the world had ever seen. On the far side of the Atlantic, the United States had declared neutrality, but whilst the war raged on in Europe, Black Americans were fighting a war of their own, a war for equality, freedom and acceptance. You see, this was the era of Jim Crow, a truly terrible era of racial segregation, emboldened and legalised by the doctrine of separate but equal. Following Plessy v. Ferguson, it was ruled that races could be segregated so long as each race had their own equal facilities. But of course, the facilities were not equal. Now, there's long been a bit of a divide between the North and the South and their treatment of Black Americans. Remember, it was the South that was all for the expansion of slavery, so of course it was here that Jim Crow laws flourished, as white Southerners jumped at a chance to establish their superiority. The laws marginalised Black Americans and they allowed them to be treated like second-class citizens. They were denied certain jobs, denied an education, and prevented from exercising their right to vote. Discrimination and segregation were legal and enforceable. Black Americans were terrorised with the threat of horrific mob violence. It was a way to oppress them, to keep them in line with Jim Crow. They could be lynched for trying to vote, for speaking to a white person without the respect and reverence that they felt they deserved, or simply looking at a white person the wrong way. There were usually no repercussions for this mob violence. In fact, the lynchers were often applauded for their crimes. It was a job well done. Thankfully, things were slightly better in the North. There were more opportunities for education. For the most part, black men could vote. And thanks to the North's mixed economy, the jobs there were much more lucrative than those in the agricultural South. Now, the South was becoming a less and less appealing place to live by the day, and not just because of the horrific racism, but because there had been devastating floods and an outbreak of the pesky boll weevil. This meant that farmers had lost their entire crops. It was a really dire situation. In the north, though, demand for workers was absolutely skyrocketing, all thanks to the war in Europe. So in 1910 began the Great Migration, and this picked up even more after the war started in Europe. Black Americans fled the Jim Crow South, moving northward and settling in cities such as Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York, where they would build vibrant black communities. Harlem in New York would become one of these, and here black pride would grow and thrive. You see, this new, tightly knit community allowed for healing, it created a renewed sense of self-worth, and it rekindled the fire to fight for change. Black Americans have fought in all of America's major conflicts, playing a huge part in America winning its independence and the Union winning the Civil War. Now, participation in both of these wars resulted in emancipation of some kind, so it wasn't unreasonable to conclude that military service could be used as a means to prove your worth, as a bargaining chip for freedom and change. Now, of course, the US military was segregated and black Americans were often relegated to labour battalions. But there were exceptions. For instance, Chicago had its 8th Illinois Regiment, the first all-black National Guard unit, commanded by all-black officers. They were the pride of Chicago, and their stellar performance in the Spanish-American War showed that black men could be effective soldiers even when not commanded by white officers. And that black men, well, they could lead. For a long time, New York's black community had wanted a black National Guard unit of their very own, just like the 8th Illinois. With their renewed sense of self-worth came an even greater push to achieve this goal, and achieve it they would, with the help of a fabulous fellow called Charles Fillmore. Charles Fillmore was a dashing black veteran of the Spanish-American War, who I might add was also an attorney and a Treasury official. Fillmore would establish a provisional regiment, recruiting the best and the brightest from the black community. Now, the move from provisional to official status, well, it wouldn't be easy. It would take a lot of hard work and a few failed attempts before a bill was finally signed approving such a regiment. It was signed by Governor William Sulzer in June 1913, and it was a joyous moment for New York's black community.
Uh-oh, I feel another butt coming along.
Yep, there's always a but, isn't there? There was a compromise made. The bill stipulated that all new officers appointed to the regiment would have to be white. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, then came another blow. Governor Sulzer was impeached for misusing campaign funds. With his removal from office, all progress on the regiment grinded to a halt, and the signed bill would just sit there, gathering dust. As the years went by, Fillmore's dream seemed to be fading away. But 1916 would bring about a very unlikely catalyst. Pancho Villa was carrying out raids along the US-Mexican border, and as a result, many New York National Guards were mobilised and deployed to deal with it. With all those troops gone, it soon became clear that the state needed a new regiment, and what luck, the new governor, Charles Whitman, stumbled upon that dusty old bill. Whitman decided that it was finally time to organise the regiment that Fillmore and New York's black community had fought so hard for. He got in touch with a good friend of his, William Hayward, a white man, and asked him, not Fillmore, to become commanding officer of the regiment. Understandably, Fillmore was absolutely crushed, but he'd rather that than no regiment at all. Fillmore was instead offered the role of captain, which he accepted. And with this, the 15th New York National Guard, or the 15th Infantry Regiment, was born. The regiment that would go on to become the Harlem Hellfighters. So, who was this Hayward fellow? Well, he was a handsome 40-year-old lawyer. He climbed his way up to the position of colonel in the Nebraska National Guard. And he also had experience commanding black troops in the Spanish-American War. He was actually quite a good choice for the role. He felt that if black men were given the proper training, they would become the equal of any soldier in the world. Hayward's first task was to begin recruiting for the regiment. He needed around 2,000 volunteers to reach combat strength. Of course, it wouldn't be easy. It would be an uphill battle with little funding and support. The regiment wasn't given an armoury to assemble or drill in. They weren't given weapons, kit, or uniforms. Their first recruiting office was set up in a cigar shop, Their headquarters at one point was in the back of a beauty parlour, and their temporary armoury was a dance hall. On the 27th of June, they opened up the doors to their makeshift recruitment office, hoping that people would be lining up round the block to enlist. But boy, was it slow. People just didn't want to join, and with that white officer stipulation, who could blame them? There'd be no opportunity to progress up the ranks. Now, Hayward was a smart guy. He knew that he needed to win over the black community. So, he made sure to keep all of the black officers from the regiment's provisional days. Charles Fillmore, George C. Lacey, and Napoleon Bonaparte Marshall. He also shockingly went against Whitman's mandate, promising that he would indeed appoint black men as officers. The first enlistee was William Bunting, a big strapping young fellow. Hayward shook his hand and offered him the job of first sergeant, but Bunting declined. He was perfectly happy with just being a private. Luckily for Hayward, a popular African-American newspaper called Age ran an article about the recruitment drive right on its front page, alongside stories about the heroics of black soldiers. This really did the trick. Before you know it, there was a flood of enlistees, and within a week, a company of the 1st Battalion had been filled. As the size of the regiment grew, it wasn't long before there weren't enough uniforms or rifles to go around. The men marched and they drilled in theatre basements, music halls, and the streets of Harlem. But many of them had to parade and drill with broomsticks. And of course, they were laughed at. Hayward's requests for more rifles were refused, but he was a resourceful, well-connected man. He found out that there were hundreds of brand new rifles in storage, just waiting for use in civilian shooting clubs. So he instructed all of his men to become the president or secretary of their very own civilian shooting club. And it worked. They put in the orders for the rifles, and just like that, they had the guns that they needed. Parades were a really important way to drum up interest in the regiment, but their first attempts at them were rather lackluster. That was until Hayward managed to recruit one of the most successful black musicians in America, James Reese Europe. Europe, or Big Jim Europe as he was known, was big in every sense of the word. He was tall, strongly built, with a big commanding presence. He started out as a classically trained violinist, and his career had really blossomed. He'd broken through the colour line, providing music for entertainers of all races. He set up the famous Clef Club that made history when they performed their sellout performance at Carnegie Hall. And he provided music for the world-renowned white dance team of Irene and Vernon Castle.
Oh, what kind of music did he play?
Well, it was a music like no other really. It wasn't quite jazz and it wasn't quite ragtime. It was his own style. His music was revolutionary, and he's even been referred to as the Martin Luther King of music. Europe was initially reluctant to join the regiment. You see, his dream was to establish a national black orchestra and to make musicals with all black casts. He thought long and hard about it. He could see the potential of the regiment, that it could be used as a tool for social change. Eventually, he agreed to volunteer, but he wanted to be a soldier, not a band leader. So he called Hayward's bluff. He told him that he'd make a military band, the likes of which the world had never known. But only if Hayward could raise $10,000 for it. A hell of a lot of money back then. And that wasn't the only condition. No, he wanted the band to be much, much larger than the typical military band, so that he could achieve a perfectly balanced sound. And to top it off, he wanted to choose his own musicians.
I bet he thought that would make Hayward run a mile in the other direction.
Yep, he really did. But Hayward was absolutely determined to get him on board. You see, Hayward knew that having James Europe as the band leader was of critical importance. The regimental band was one of the most influential recruiting forces, and with Europe and his revolutionary music, Hayward was sure that the regiment would reach combat strength in no time. Hayward pulled some strings, and before you know it, he had in his hand a cheque for $10,000. And as for Europe, well, he had to get cracking on setting up that band. With Europe now at the front and centre of the regiment, several other prominent men from the black community would join him, including his good friend, Noble Sissel, another well-known musician. Men from all walks of life were signing up too, absolutely starstruck to be in the same regiment as Big Jim Europe. By 1917, the war had been dragging on for years. It was a war of attrition. The United States had been doing its absolute best to stay out of it. but the pressure to enter was mounting. You see, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and was sinking US vessels. Then there was the Zimbabwe telegram. Germany was trying to coax Mexico into joining the Central Powers if the US entered the war against them. This was the final straw. On the 2nd of April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson gave a speech. The US could stay out of the war no longer. They needed to help make the world safe for democracy. Then, on the 6th of April 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. The hypocrisy of it all was not lost on Black Americans. You see, for them, the US certainly wasn't safe for democracy. With the declaration of war, Hayward worked hard to bring his regiment up to wartime strength. Luckily, the 15th had the best regimental band in the land, thanks to James Europe. It was such an effective recruitment tool that some men would later joke, if it wasn't for that damn band, I wouldn't be in this army. Volunteers included the likes of Horace Pippin. Born in Pennsylvania, he was a little bit of a budding artist. He had a passion for drawing, and as a child, he'd won a box of crayons from a magazine drawing contest. He and his mother moved to New York, and at 14, he started working for a farmer who actually offered to send him to art school. It would have been a fabulous opportunity, but sadly his mother got sick and he had to get a better paying job to help support her. When he joined the 15th, he was 29 years old, and his passion for art was still burning strong. So everywhere he went, he had a set of crayons, pencils, and a notebook. William Butler from Salisbury, Maryland, he was a jack of all trades. He enlisted in the early days of the regiment and was described as a slight, good-natured youth. And our two heroes from earlier, Needham Roberts, an articulate young man who worked as a hotel bellhop and a clerk in a drugstore. He had tried to join the 15th in 1916, but he was turned down because he was too young. He was determined to serve his country though, so he would try again. His father had given him some money to pay their poll tax, but Roberts had other ideas. Instead of paying the taxes, he used the money to travel to New York. He lied about his age, saying that he was 19 when he was in fact only 16. The recruiter believed him, and he successfully enlisted with the 15th. Henry Johnson, a sweet, unassuming boy, at 5'4" and 130 pounds, he was quite a bit smaller than most of the volunteers. But as you've seen, he could certainly put up a fight. He was born in North Carolina, and in his teens he ran away from home to Albany, New York. He hoped life would be better there. He got himself a job as a baggage handler for the New York Central Railroad, and he sometimes picked up extra work in a soda shop. He found love in his early 20s, marrying a minister's daughter called Edna. By 1917, most of his friends had joined the 15th, and he felt it was his duty to do the same. Hayward had big dreams for his regiment. He hoped that they might be chosen to represent New York in the new Rainbow Division. The division was going to be made by selecting elite National Guard units from 26 states and the District of Columbia. It was dubbed the nation's first all-American division, a symbol of national unity. And how terrific it would be if one of the regiments was black. Hayward pulled all the strings that he could to try and make this dream a reality. He wanted his regiment to be the best and the most ready, so he won them a spot at a camp in Peekskill for training. During their 18 days there, they did fantastically, learning so much in such a short period of time. They learned how to be riflemen and hit targets 600 yards away, and they could now drill as well as any regiment in the New York Guard. By June of 1917, Hayward had managed to recruit enough men and officers to qualify the regiment for federal service. They were the first National Guard regiment in the entire country to reach this milestone, and Hayward hoped that this feat would get them noticed and increase their chances of being picked for that shiny new Rainbow Division. Hayward then got his men another round of training, this time at Camp Whitman, and after this, the men were sent on active duty. Now, this active duty wasn't what they had hoped for. They wanted to fight for their country, but instead they were made to guard public works and properties. The problem was that the War Department wasn't really sure what to do with black soldiers. White soldiers didn't want to fight alongside them, and as far as the department was concerned, their job was to win wars, not solve the nation's race problems. So, separate, segregated units were the answer, either black soldiers commanded by black officers, or black soldiers commanded by white officers. On the whole, it was decided that it was best to put black soldiers into labour units. Many believed that black men were cowardly, inferior, and just wouldn't do well in combat. And another reason was because white society didn't like the idea of arming and training black men to fight, especially when the enemy, the Germans, were white themselves. Whilst the 15th carried out their guard duties, racial tensions were rising and the War Department was seemingly fanning the flames. You see, the department had a habit of sending black troops to the Jim Crow South. It was just a disaster waiting to happen. The department had sent a group of black soldiers to Houston, Texas, where the white residents subjected them to police brutality, public beatings, racial slurs. The list of injustices go on. The soldiers eventually reached breaking point. They had had enough. 100 of them grabbed their weapons and they marched into town. Waiting for them were armed police officers and armed white citizens. The result was a gunfight that claimed many lives. Then there was another much smaller incident, where a theatre manager in Kansas wouldn't sell a ticket to a black sergeant, even though there was no official policy of segregation there. This resulted in the famous Army Bulletin No. 35, which stated that the sergeant was strictly within his legal rights in this matter, and the theatre manager is legally wrong. Nevertheless, the sergeant is guilty of the greater wrong in doing anything, no matter how legally correct, that will provoke race animosity.
What? That's absolute bull.
Language, Gargi. But yeah, you're right, it is. And I'm not done yet. The bulletin then went on to say that they should avoid every situation that can give rise to racial ill will, and don't go where your presence is not desired. Now, with all this racial tension, you'd think that the War Department would see sense and stop sending black troops to the South, but they didn't. The department declared that the 15th would need to go to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, for combat training. No black man in their right mind would ever choose to go to this town. One of the 15th's officers, Hamilton Fish, could see that this would just end in disaster, and he pleaded with the department to send the unit to France to train instead. Anything would be better than the Jim Crow South. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and there was more bad news to come. Hayward's application to the Rainbow Division had been rejected. He'd received a cuttingly callous response. Black was not a colour of the rainbow.
But white isn't a colour of the rainbow either.
Exactly. The 69th Regiment was chosen to represent New York in the Rainbow Division instead. And Hayward heard that they would also be sent to Spartanburg to train, and that the 69th were going to have a big send-off, a fabulous farewell parade down 5th Avenue. Hayward tried to get his men included in this parade too, but his application for this was also denied. With all of these setbacks, Hayward knew that he needed to keep morale high. He gathered up his men, raised his hand, and vowed that even if they won't let us parade with them in going away, that we will have a parade when we come home that will be the greatest parade that New York has ever seen. The town of Spartanburg soon got wind that 2,000 black soldiers would be stationed there at Camp Wadsworth, and boy were they not happy. Funnily enough though, they'd actually campaigned really hard for the camp to be built there. It would bring in money, you see, but in their wildest dreams, they never imagined that it would be used to train black soldiers. The mayor of the town, John Floyd, kicked up a huge fuss, saying that it was a great mistake to send black men from the north there with their northern ideas about race equality. A chamber official also chimed in, saying that if any of those black soldiers go in any of our soda stores and the like and ask to be served, they'll be knocked down. Somebody will throw a bottle. We have our customs down here, and we aren't going to alter them. With those wonderful kind words lodged firmly in their minds, the men of the 15th went to Spartanburg on the 8th of October, 1917. The feeling of dread must have been palpable. They knew that simply standing to attention, standing with pride, could cause the white men of Spartanburg to attack them. Hayward briefed his men, telling them that they must refuse to meet the white citizens upon the undignified plane of prejudice and brutality. That if blows are struck, that all of the violence and all of the blows are on one side, and that side is not our side. There could not be a repeat of that terrible incident in Houston. Of course, it wasn't long before the trouble began. 2 white men threw a black soldier into a gutter. They were offended that he'd been walking on the sidewalk. Signs were put up with racial slurs. Captain Napoleon Marshall had bought a ticket to ride the trolley. He sat himself in the trolley and was minding his own business when a bunch of white men started shouting insults at him. The next thing he knew, he was thrown off the trolley. Then, 2 black soldiers went missing. A white truck driver had started a rumour that the police had lynched them. 44 soldiers armed themselves and they marched into town. They waited outside of the police station and sent in 2 soldiers to inquire about the missing men. It wasn't long before word got round to Hayward, and he drove into town as quickly as he could. He had to prevent another Houston. When he got there, he found his men standing at ease and in perfect order. They threatened no one. His men saluted him and allowed him to go inside and speak to the police. They knew nothing about the missing soldiers, and they even let Hayward inspect the jail. In the end, it would turn out that there was no lynching at all. The 2 missing men had gotten lost coming home in the night and fallen asleep in a field. It was a close call. Too close of a call for Hayward's liking. So he went to Washington, D.C. to try and get his men taken out of that hellhole of a town. Whilst he was gone, disaster would strike. James Europe and his friend Noble Cecil had been asked by a local minister to perform at a church service. They dutifully accepted the request, hoping that a shared love of music would help break down barriers in the community. Their performance was stellar as usual, and once they finished up, the 2 friends grabbed a bite to eat at a food stand. They ate and they chatted a while. Europe said to Cecil, "I wonder where we can get some New York papers." A local black man overheard him and called out, "You can get New York papers right over there in the lobby of the hotel." Europe eyed up the hotel suspiciously. "Is it a white hotel?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the man replied, "but it's quite all right to go in there." "Go on over, sis," Europe said, playfully nudging his friend. "Get every paper that has the word New York on it. I never knew how sweet New York was till I landed here." Cecil wasn't convinced. He didn't want to go, but he also didn't want Europe to see him as a coward. He took a deep breath and made his way into the hotel lobby. There were some white soldiers in there. He smiled at them and walked up to the newspaper stand. He bought the papers and was just about to leave when someone grabbed him by the collar and knocked his hat to the floor. It was the hotel owner, who called him some racial slurs and then barked, "Don't you know enough to take your hat off?" Cecil looked around and saw that everyone else in the lobby was wearing a hat. Remembering Hayward's words, he didn't want to make a scene, so he quietly bent over to pick up his hat. The hotel owner kicked him and shouted, "Damn you and the government." Cecil made a run for it as the man kicked him 3 more times. The white soldiers in the lobby saw what had happened, and they were outraged. "Kill him," they shouted. "Pull his hotel down about his ears," they screamed. They were about to rush towards the man when, luckily for him, James Europe stepped in. "Attention," he called out. Now remember, I told you that Big Jim had a commanding presence. Well, boy, did he put that to work here. The white soldiers and officers stopped dead in their tracks. "Get your hats and coats and leave this place quietly. Walk out separately or in 2s to Main Street," he said. The men did exactly what they were told. Europe then turned his gaze towards the hotel owner. The man didn't thank his unlikely saviour. Oh no. Instead, the owner started threatening to kick Europe, just like he did to Cecil, if he didn't take off his hat. Europe calmly removed his hat and asked what exactly Cecil had done wrong. The owner simply repeated his racist hat policy and tried to order Europe out of the hotel. Europe, standing at over 6 foot tall, stared the man right in the eyes, an act of defiance in the Jim Crow South. Then, with quiet dignity, he turned his back and walked into the street.
Wow, what a man! Europe's my new idol.
Ah, good choice. With that, it was high time for the 15th to get the heck out of Spartanburg. They received orders that they were being sent to Camp Mills, where they would prepare to ship out for France. The news that they were heading to France was sudden and a little bit of a shock. Europe would say to Cecil, "I'm sure sorry I sent you in after those papers. Here, the man has kicked us right to France." At Camp Mills, things were just as bad. the men were billeted near the 167th Alabama National Guard. They were a racist bunch that had recently beat a black man until he was blind. They put up signs saying whites only, which the 15th, of course, tore down. Then there was a rumour that the Alabamians were going to attack the 15th in the middle of the night. Now, worse still, because of all the conflict between the two units, the black soldiers had been made to turn in their ammunition. But surprise, surprise, the Alabamians weren't told to do that. With no ammo, the 15th would be completely and utterly defenceless against an attack. The men feared for their lives. Luckily, some fellow white New Yorkers from a different regiment would step in to help, giving the 15th some ammo to defend themselves with. In the end, the two units confronted each other, but thank goodness, a gunfight was averted. 2 weeks went by and the men were kept in the dark about when they'd be headed to France. On the 12th of November 1917, the day had finally come. The men of the 15th boarded the USS Pocahontas, a rickety old ship that would take them to France. Well, it would get them there eventually, after 4 attempts. Nothing was ever smooth sailing for the 15th, it would seem. On the first attempt, one of the ship's piston rods snapped. On the second attempt, there was a fire in the coal bunkers. On the third attempt, an oil tanker collided with the ship, tearing a hole in it. Now, the convoy refused to wait for them though, so the ship had to be patched up at sea. On the fourth attempt, they finally made it to France, arriving on the 27th of December. In the words of Hayward, we landed at Brest, right side up. The 15th entered Brest in style, with James Europe's band playing a jazzy version of the French national anthem. They brought jazz to France, and my goodness, did the French love it. The 15th then boarded boxcars to God knows where. In true military style, they were kept in the dark. They thought they were heading to get more combat training, and then onto the front. Instead, they arrived in Saint-Nazaire, where they would serve as a labour battalion. They did a fabulous job laying railroad tracks and building storage warehouses. But this work would prove nothing to the political leaders back home. They needed a chance to prove themselves on the battlefield, to make America proud and to come home as heroes. If they did that, then they couldn't possibly be denied equality, could they? Hayward was working really hard to try and get his men reassigned. He wrote letters to the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, General John Pershing, singing the regiment's praises, trying to persuade him. He made sure there was good press coverage of his regiment in the papers, and he sent Europe's band on a tour around France to try and build up the regiment's reputation. The British and the French were desperate for more combat troops. The 15th were right there, ready to go, but the US refused to let them fight. On the 3rd of March 1918, Russia and Germany signed a treaty that ended their fighting. Now that Russia was out of the war, Germany didn't have to fight on 2 fronts anymore. This was exactly the catalyst that Hayward needed. On the 10th of March, their dreams would come true. General Pershing finally made the 15th a combat unit. Pershing would load them to the French, and they would now be the 369th, part of the 16th Division of the 4th French Army. Quite the mouthful. Now, their new assigned number was a little bit of an insult. In the US, numbers over 200 were assigned to troops that were drafted, but they weren't drafted, they were volunteers. And to rub salt in the wound, they'd been cast aside, pawned off from the French, rather than being part of the AEF. Hayward would say our great American general simply put the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, pulled the bell and went away. To which the French replied, "Welcome, little black baby." The band and the regiment were soon reunited, and off they went for intensive training in the French art of war and principles of combat. They were allowed to keep their old uniforms, but had to give up their Springfield rifles for the French Lebel. The French rifles were a definite downgrade. They were outdated, they jammed easily, and the magazine clips only held 3 bullets, compared to the Springfield's 5. They learnt so much. They learnt about trench warfare, how to use their new Lebels, how to use machine guns and hand grenade launchers, what the different German shells sounded like, what to do in a gas attack, and how to tell what gas had been used by the smell. The list goes on. They ate French rations, and they were also given a daily portion of wine that was meant to last for the day, but they mistranslated to mean 10 minutes. One thing that really stood out to the men was the fact that the French were far less racist towards them and generally treated them with respect. Dare I say, as equals. Now, of course, the white Americans did try to bring their breed of racism to France with whites only signs and the like. Worst of all though, a secret memo was sent out telling the French not to get too friendly with the black soldiers, not to spoil them, and not to praise them too much in front of white American soldiers. The French paid this memo no mind though, and continued to treat the black soldiers as equals and with respect. After their training, the 369th were itching to get on the front lines to do their part. Their motto, and later on their battle cry, became, "God damn, let's go." They wouldn't have to wait much longer. On the 13th of April 1918, they would begin their first stint in the trenches. All in all, they would spend 191 days in the front line, the longest of any American regiment in the war. Lieutenant Big Jim Europe would soon get his first taste of adventure. He was visiting 3 French officers in their dugout, sharing a bottle of wine. They were having a jolly old time recounting their war stories, and Europe listened intently, but had none of his own to share. Now, the wine must have gone to his head, because in his words, he found himself talking biggity and said, "One thing I wish to do is go on a raid." One of the officers jumped up, patted him on the back and said, "Bravo, we're going on a raid tonight, and you can come with us. Just get permission from your colonel." Oops, he wanted to go on a raid, but maybe not just yet. He went to Colonel Hayward to ask permission. In his heart, he hoped he'd say no, but Hayward was very excited for him to get the experience. There was no backing down now. Night began to fall, and it was time to prepare. He exchanged his American uniform for an old French one, his helmet for an old cloth cap. Helmets would make too much noise in no man's land, and his lapel for a tiny automatic pistol, the size of a cap gun. The raiding party was made up of about 30 men. He was so at ease, they made it seem like they were going on a picnic. After another drink of wine, it was time to go. They made their way, single file through the maze of trenches, until they reached the jumping off point. The silence was terrifying. Europe wished that someone would make a noise, just clear their throats, or something, anything. An officer whispered, "Step aside, please," and one by one, the raiding party went over the top. Europe would later confess to his friend Cecil, "If only I had the wings of a dove, I would have flown away." Finally, it was his turn. He followed an officer out of the trench, falling on his belly until they reached a gap cut in their own barbed wire. Through the gap they went, stumbling in the intense darkness out into no man's land. It was a beautiful night. Europe would say that every star seemed as bright as a shining silver light. It seemed they were mockingly winking their eyes at me, and how I wished I could change places with them. One officer went on ahead, unfurling a wall of white tape, marking the shortest route to the German trenches and the shortest route back. Soon, Europe could hear the French artillery opening up behind them. Shells were flying overhead like 1,000 pheasants, hitting the German trenches. There was explosion after explosion. A French officer fired a red flare, the signal that it was time to attack. Every man rose to a crouch, and they clambered through a hole in the German wire. They were now in the German trench. They darted around, throwing grenades into each and every dugout. His heart raced, and he gripped his pistol. Where was the counterattack? Where were the Germans? The trench was empty. Time had slowed to a crawl, and what felt like 3 hours was actually only 3 minutes. The French officer fired a green flare. The raid was over. One by one, the soldiers followed the white tape to the exit in the German barbed wire. They ran back across no man's land as fast as their legs could carry them, and as they reached French lines, the Germans opened a counterattack. Europe would later say, "Don't tell me Frenchmen can't run." He dived into a dugout where he would stay until the shelling stopped. Europe would of course recount his story to Cecil, who would say, "Goodness gracious, Lieutenant, it's all right to go where duty calls, but you were too valuable to go flirting with death like that." Europe told Cecil not to worry. The only way that he'd be going on another raid is if he received orders from General Pershing himself with his name signed and re-signed. A German raiding party had managed to capture some members of the 369th, First Lieutenant Gorman Jones, and 4 of his men. The raiding party were going to take them back to the German lines as prisoners. As they dragged the captured men across no man's land, they passed a listening post where Sergeant William Butler was hiding. Butler had to do something to save his brothers in arms. He could not let them be taken prisoner. He waited until the raiding party came closer. It was now time to pounce. "Look out, I'm coming!" he shouted as he launched himself out of the trench, his automatic rifle ready to go. "Don't fire, Butler," Lieutenant Jones started back. "Not yet, sir, but soon," replied Butler. The Germans were startled and turned to face Butler. In the darkness, they thought that it was an ambush, but they were surrounded. Lieutenant Jones and his 4 men took advantage of the confusion and they dropped to cover. "Let 'em have it," Lieutenant Jones called out, and Butler did just that. He opened fire, killing 4 of the German soldiers. The raiding party bolted, fleeing in all directions, and Butler continued firing at them. He managed to take the German lieutenant alive, but he later died from his injuries. It's thought that he killed around 10 enemy soldiers and wounded several more. William Butler had saved the day. It was a close call, but the 369th could still proudly say that they'd never had a man taken prisoner. Horace Pippin, a budding artist, had proven himself to be a very capable soldier and was soon promoted to corporal. A German sniper had been picking off his fellow soldiers, craftily waiting for the mess call when they knew that the men would be moving around and they'd be easier to hit. They were also disrupting the ration supply by taking out members of the ration squad. Something had to be done. Pippin and another corporal were tasked with bringing down the sniper. Now, Pippin was smart, and from the fact that the sniper could shoot down into the front trench, he deduced that they must be hiding up in a tree. The 2 corporals surveyed the surrounding terrain day and night and in the pouring rain, looking for any changes that would give away the sniper's location. They were looking for the telltale puff of smoke, but they could see nothing. There was a nearby hill with some bushes and trees, and Pippin, he thought that that would be the perfect place for a sniper to hide. He found a thicket where he had a good view of those trees on the hill, and he hid there until mess time when he knew that the sniper would likely strike. He heard the unmistakable crack of the sniper's rifle, and with his eagle eye, he saw that the leaves moved on one of the trees. Aha! He had found the sniper. He fired his rifle at the spot in the tree where he thought the sniper would be. There was a rustle and a thud as the sniper fell out of the tree to the ground. Pippin had saved the day. The war raged on, and the 369th would fight valiantly in some of its most grueling battles, including the Meuse-Argonne offensive. By the end of the war, they had certainly proven themselves on the battlefield, but at great cost. They'd suffered the highest casualty rate of any American regiment. Of the original 2,000 men, 1,300 had either been killed or wounded. The fighting finally came to an end on the 11th of November 1918, and 9 days later, the 369th would be the first Allied unit to reach the Rhine. The 369th were also the first of the New York troops to return home, and, true to Hayward's word, they were given the biggest and best parade that New York had ever seen. They marched with pride, knowing what they had achieved. This regiment that had once wielded broomsticks that had been set up to fail due to the prejudices against them were now the first Allied unit to the Rhine, a unit that would be so storied because of their many brave and heroic feats. A unit that never lost a foot of ground, and I'd like to point out that the Rainbow Division did lose ground. A unit that had never had a man taken prisoner. The French rewarded them with 170 individual citations for the Croix de Guerre, as well as a citation for the entire unit. A number of them received the Distinguished Service Cross, but the highest US military award, the Medal of Honor, was off limits due to the colour of their skin. They'd certainly won the war for democracy abroad, but the war for democracy at home was still far from over. Lynchings of black Americans were on the rise, and racial violence would only get worse during the Red Summer of 1919. In the words of the great W.E.B. Du Bois, we return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy, We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America. Or know the reason why. Henry Johnson arrived back home a hero. He was celebrated and he went on tours where he recounted his war stories for adoring crowds. Sadly, this all came to a screeching halt when he decided to speak up about the racism his regiment faced. He was tossed aside and his life would take a turn for the worse. Because of his injuries, Johnson wasn't able to work. He turned to alcohol and his marriage eventually broke down. He died poor and forgotten in 1929. It wasn't until after his death that he received the recognition that he deserved. He was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart in 1996, the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002, and finally, in 2015, Obama would award him the Medal of Honor. Needham Roberts also returned home a hero. Sadly, the injuries he sustained were very severe and they limited the work he could do. To supplement his income, he gave talks about his time in the war, and would also go on to help with the recruitment drive for World War II. He was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart in 1996 and the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002. Big Jim Europe was ready to take the world by storm with his absolutely fabulous music, but sadly his life was cut short. He was murdered by a fellow musician in May 1919. William Butler was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm and the Distinguished Service Cross. For heroically saving 5 of his fellow soldiers from being taken prisoner, Hayward nominated him for the Medal of Honor, but sadly, the nomination was dismissed. During the war, Butler endured a gas attack and, from then on, was plagued with horrific bronchitis and anemia. He also suffered several gunshot wounds, which severely impacted his health. He ran a coal and ice business until he could no longer work due to his injuries. Sadly, he would take his own life on the 27th of November, 1947. The fight for him to get the recognition he deserves, to be awarded the Medal of Honor, still goes on. Horace Pippin lost the use of his right arm after being shot during the war. Now, he wouldn't let his injuries get in the way of his passion for art though. Instead, he used painting as a form of rehabilitation for his mind and body. His work would soon attract the attention of notable figures in the art world. His paintings were described as having folk art qualities with artistic sophistication. On his death in 1946, the New York Times would describe him as the most important black painter to have appeared in America. It wouldn't be until 1948 that the US military was desegregated, and it was the Port Chicago 50 that helped pave the way for this absolutely monumental change. So make sure to watch my video on that if you'd like to learn more about their brave fight for equality. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe. Remember that we're all equal, and I hope you have a magnificent day.